Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video.
Last week, we finished with the other terms, filling out the home warranty section, the TC fee, any other fees or costs that may have been negotiated. We went through those last week. Quickly before I share my screen, does anybody have any questions? Just remember, type your questions in the chat or raise your hand, and then I'll get to you to unmute you if you have a question. Does anybody have anything right now before I share my screen? All right. Well, then let's jump right in. Okay. So again, what you guys should be seeing. You should be seeing right now, again, the RPA, and it's on paragraph 3Q and 3R that we're looking at. We went through those, the fees that are being paid. And again, this section, 3Q, is all of the allocation of costs, who pays for what. These are Q16 and 17 are open, the things that may not be addressed in the contract that you can attach. And then the home warranty section. And remember, when we're doing the home warranties, if you're looking for specific coverages, those specific coverages need to be added in this section on Q18. They need to be written here, and make sure that the amount that you have here is the proper amount to cover all of these coverages. Okay, so you got to make sure that's done. And then again, we talked about other terms that would go in there. That's just anything that you need to add that there wasn't a place for in the previous paragraph in the contract. So like we talked about, subject to interior inspection, your relationship to the client, your relationship to, that you are actually the buyer, that you're working as the principal, those are the things that would be written in there. Okay. All right. So just make sure, and I didn't cover this on the other 2 pages that we want to, just make sure that when you submit this stuff that your buyer initials everywhere they're supposed to, and that double check to make sure the dates are up here. We're still looking at an old date because we started so long ago, but make sure the proper date is up there when you're writing that offer. Okay, so now paragraph 3 is all of the paragraphs where we fill stuff out. This now is we're going to start heading into what's also accompanying this offer and the explanations for the previous paragraph 3 and each one of those little sections that we went through when we were filling out the offer and the negotiation part. So let's look at, this is what's going to happen. If any of these things need to be attached, this box is going to be checked. So as you can see, because earlier in one of the classes, I think 2 weeks ago, we talked about tenant occupied properties, that you have to have the TOPA included. And we checked off that box earlier, so it checked off the box here. So if you were, for example, like we did, we went to the tenant occupied property addendum and we checked the box here, it has added it already for us here. Okay, so that's already been added. These other type of property type addenda, so if this was an offer that we were writing on a probate, then we would have this box checked to make sure that the probate purchase addendum was incorporated. If it's a manufactured home, mobile home, we have to make sure this box is checked to make sure it's incorporated, because it is an amendment to this purchase agreement that is specific to that type of property. Same thing for the tenants in common property, stock cooperatives, and mixed use purchase addendum. Now, these are the mixed use, the stock cooperative, and the tenancy in common are relatively new. But those are specific items that need to be addressed for that type of property. Those mixed use properties are for like a commercial property that may have one residential unit and you attach this to it. Okay. These are the other addenda that you may have to incorporate, right? So if you needed space, right, like we had talked about, addendums are for space, not for negotiating. If I needed space at some point previously in the contract, I would have this addendum, and it would be addendum number 1 that's attached to this RPA. But We don't need an addendum right now, so we're not going to attach it. The backup offer addendum, that would be required to be attached if, for example, I'm submitting my offer and the listing agent has already told me you're going to be a backup offer. I would fill out that backup offer addendum and I would incorporate that with my purchase agreement. The septic well, property monument, and propane addendum, the SWPI, that's required if you have a property that has a septic tank or a well that they use for their water, right? And there are some properties still that do that. The buyer's intent to exchange is if the buyer is writing this offer as part of the tax-deferred exchange. So they've already sold a property or are in the process of selling one, and this will be their exchange property as an income property. You have to check that off and have it incorporated. The short sale addendum would be incorporated for what it sounds like. If this were an offer we were writing on a short sale, we would incorporate the short sale addendum. That short sale addendum has terms specific to the short sale and how we get approval and the contingency that goes along with getting that short sale approved. The court confirmation addendum would be necessary if it were something other than a probate that needed court confirmation, like a bankruptcy sale, something like that. But the court confirmation addendum, if it is court confirmation required, that'll be handled for a probate in the probate purchase addendum. And then the seller's intent to exchange. Now, most of the time we're writing an offer, right? We're talking about writing the offer. We're not going to attach the seller's intent to exchange because it's the reverse of the buyer, which is saying this seller that we're writing an offer on is going to be exchanging into another property. That would be their responsibility to send us because we don't know the terms and we don't know the condition of that exchange. So the chances of us checking that off to submit an offer, probably not going to happen, okay? And then we have all the buyer and seller advisories that are available to come with the property. All that you guys have to understand, and we're talking about writing strong offers, is if any of these boxes are checked for these things, make sure that it is included when you send the offer. Because I know that it adds it into your transaction. I know that happens. We check the box, it's in the transaction. And some of these things are defaulted. They're always checked. The buyer's investigation advisory, the fair housing discrimination advisory, the consumer privacy, and the wire fraud advisory. Those are always going to come with your offer. Okay, always. But some of these others might not, and you might want to include them. But you have to make sure when we're talking about strength of offer that everything that I have checked is going. And if am I going to send a document and I don't have these checked off, I need to do that too. It's the same thing. Just sending you a document doesn't necessarily make it part of the purchase agreement unless these boxes are checked. And in reviewing people's offers, when I look at RPAs from agents and they have me review them, one of the biggest things that are missing is the checked boxes that incorporate these items into the purchase agreement. So you can't ignore the boxes. Just because you put a number next to a box doesn't mean that that's how it's incorporated. You've got to check the box. So I know it seems silly. Everybody sees there's a number written there, or that, we've sent you the document. But if I sign this offer, for example, if I sent, like a buyer's intent to exchange or a COP, right? But I didn't check the box to incorporate the COP. And the seller signs and accepts my offer, but doesn't sign the COP, then technically that purchase isn't contingent on the buyer selling their property. So the checking of boxes on the forms is really important because it then states that by accepting this, I've also have to accept that other form because it's checked off and it's part of this document. So you can't ignore it. Okay. So make sure that whatever's checked off here is included when you submit your offer. Always double check. Always double check. Any questions? Give you guys a second. Take a pause and see if you guys have any questions about anything. Okay. So now we get into with paragraph 5. It's the reference paragraphs that you see here in this second column on paragraph 3 is going to go back to those. So really what it's going to do is it's just going to be an explanation. We're not going to dig into these today because we're talking about writing, but you guys have to understand that this is where you're going to get the information to be able to explain to your clients and refer back to for your clients where they can get clarification on items that we've already filled out, like the initial deposit. how it's delivered, when it needs to be delivered, what the increased deposit means, how that sellers can retain the deposit. Okay. It explains, gives you a definition of an all cash offer, what the loans mean, right? You could go through this. And if you just take a little bit of time and read these things, then you guys also start to sound like you get more confident and comfortable with what the offer is saying. And when you know where to refer back to when your client has a question about something, having the ability to refer back to these paragraphs is going to help you in those conversations with them. Okay. So again, breaking each thing down, additional financing terms, buyer stated financing, what that means. And this is what I would suggest, that one of the things I would suggest you make sure that you talk to your client about is that once you state the type of financing that you're, right, when you submit your offer. So for example, I write an offer and it appears to be conventional offer, right? Or it is a conventional offer. So I submit my original offer as a conventional. And then my lender comes back to me as buyer and says, hey, by the way, if you were to switch from conventional FHA, your interest rate would drop by 0.25%, 0.5%. So that for me as buyer, I think, okay, well, what does that mean? What's the difference in the payment, right? And all of a sudden it's a huge difference in payment. It makes more sense for me to do it. So I say, yeah, let's switch to FHA. But I do not get the seller's authorization to switch from conventional to FHA. They accepted my offer based on the information I gave them, and at the time it was a conventional loan. Now there's differences between conventional and FHA, and obviously, FHA sometimes requires more repairs than a conventional might. There's things with the appraisal. If I wrote my offer over and I had removed an appraisal contingency and now I have to have an FHA VA, the mandatory clause signed, it now really nullifies that removal of my appraisal contingency. So there are some differences, based on the financing, some reasons why a seller might not want to allow you to switch from conventional to FHA. But if you do it without asking for their permission, right, you just choose to go FHA, they can't cancel on you, but they don't have to help you with the process of getting approved, right? They don't have to cooperate with doing repairs or any of the other things, which they don't normally have to do anyway. But what happens is if you cannot close because of that loan, or you don't qualify for that new loan that you switch to, the FHA loan that you switch to from conventional, the seller does not have to honor your loan contingency any longer. You would have to then switch back to the original financing and close the escrow that way. Danny, you have your hand up, so go ahead.
Hey, Kyle, in the past, we have had other classes specifically on that question of when you change financing from FHA to conventional, then you go into escrow, and it's completely different financing. I believe we've had classes in the past where you said, you know what, the seller can go ahead and cancel.
Yeah, we have that in the past, but it's not the case any longer. It changed when the purchase agreement changed, not this last time, but a year or two ago when it changed to the format that we look at today. That changed from the stated financing to just say that they don't have to cooperate with the new financing, but your loan contingency no longer protects you because you've changed financing based on what they accepted. Okay. All right. Any other questions about that? So just what you have to do is you have to make sure that it's clear to your buyer that that's the case, because sometimes the lender talks to the buyer without talking to you, and they come up with something and then they approach you. So just make sure. And what happens is this generally wouldn't happen if you use the same lender as often as possible or for the majority of your transactions, and they communicate with you because you guys are a team. But when you're allowing buyers to bring in their own lenders when they show up, and which is fine, they can use their own lender, but you don't have a relationship with that lender. So the communication generally goes directly to the buyer and not to you. And buyers make choices without letting you know. So that's why I'm stating, as we're talking about strength of offer stuff, this needs to be something that's expressed to them, especially when they're not using one of your lenders that you have a relationship with. Okay. here's the descriptions and a more detail about closing and occupancy, the condition of the property at closing. This is always one I like to mention to you guys. As is already in the RPA. So the counter offers of property to be delivered as is not necessary. So one of the issues I have with listing agents is they don't like to counter things that they should, but they love to counter things that they don't need to, right? So, I'll look at an offer and say, well, you didn't counter this, or this, but one of their counters is property is sold as is, no repairs. There's no need for that. The property is already being delivered as is in its present physical condition as of the date of acceptance. What that's saying is that it's all up to you to determine if that condition that exists is to your liking as buyer. And guess when you get to do that? During your 17 days of investigation and inspection. That's when you get to choose whether the condition is right. And you can submit a request for repairs. The seller has no obligation to accept the request for repairs, has no obligation to perform any repairs, has no obligation to credit you anything. That's already established here. And writing as is in a counter doesn't change that. It doesn't change the right that if you write as is in a counter and as is, seller will not do repairs, it does not strip the right of the buyer to request repairs. Okay? So from a listing agent standpoint, you have to think about the communication you have with your sellers, because this is one of the things I always like to mention is that this is where it causes a seller to question you. Because what we do is, as listing agent, we write in our counter, hey, I'm going to show them that they're not doing anything. So it's sold as is, no repairs. And my seller sees that when they sign the counter before I submit it to the buyer. So the seller's assumption is that means I am not going to have to do repairs. Nobody's going to question my repair, ask me for the repairs, because they know it's as is. And then 2 weeks later, after an inspection's done, guess what shows up? A request for repairs. So now when the listing agent has to go to the seller and say, hey, the buyers are submitting a request for repairs, the seller's going to say to the listing agent, well, why did we bother with that counter if they're still able to request repairs? It makes them less confident in the choices that you make. Instead of us just having a conversation with the seller and say, hey, we have to make disclosures clear about the condition of the property. Everything that you could possibly know about it, we have to disclose it, right? Like that kind of whatever you know about the items, and we're going to go through this, you have to disclose it. The buyers are going to do an inspection. They're going to do investigations. They might do multiple. They might have, a general home inspector come out. They might have a roofer come out. They might have a termite company come out. They may have, a plumber come out. They have the right to do all of these investigations during the 17 days. And from those investigations, they might find some things that we didn't know and couldn't disclose as part of the disclosures. And they may make a request for repairs. Now, you have no obligation as seller to do any of those repairs. But the buyer is going to make the chances are the buyer will make some request for repairs. Okay, so we have to be prepared for that. And instead of us having a conversation with the seller like that and explaining what it means for the investigation periods and requests for repairs, we write a sentence like property sold as is, no repairs. And that's fine if a seller tells me, hey, I'm not going to do any repairs. I can tell them, terrific. You don't have to. You're not required to. Just keep in mind that the buyer has the right to ask for those repairs. And if you choose not to do them, it's their choice whether they continue with the transaction or cancel, not yours. Okay, we just have to have those conversations with our clients and be clear, and vice versa with our buyers. Hey, this property sold as is. The seller is going to make you some disclosures based on what they may or may not know about the property, and sometimes the sellers don't know all the defects that exist in a home. So we're going to do an inspection. We're going to do a professional home inspection, and if that home inspection advises us to check the roof, or advises to check plumbing, or advises us to check the foundation, then I'm going to go to you and I'm going to say, hey, your home inspection says you should do a foundation inspection. Is that something you want to do? And if you tell me no, even though I tell you it's a good idea, then we're going to have something in writing, an email or something else that states that I explained to you what that was and you chose not to have that inspection done. And then if you find some things, we're going to write up a request for repairs. Now, what I need you to understand about this request for repairs that we're going to submit to the seller is they have no obligation to respond. They have no obligation to perform any of those repairs, even if they are lender-required repairs. So I need you to understand that we can make the request, but you're going to have to make a choice at some point if they choose not to do those repairs, whether the house is still is still the home that you want, or you want to move on and look for something else, right? I should be having that conversation with my buyer in my buyer's consultation before we start looking at properties and explaining how it works. And I should have it again when we're writing the offer. And then I should have it again when the offer gets accepted, because I'm going to go back over timelines again. And that's the conversation that I should be having with my buyers. And that's why I wanted to kind of point to this, even though it's not about writing the offer. It's part of the strength of the offer is the buyer understanding how the condition of the property at closing works. So we got to, let's see in chat. In other words, if buyer pays for a home inspection report and show it up front, he doesn't have to do any repairs if he's selling as is. I mean, seller. Well, here's the thing. It doesn't matter if he has a report. It doesn't matter if he has super clear disclosures. It doesn't matter if his disclosures are worthless. There is nothing that forces a seller to do repairs. There's nothing in the contract that says a seller is required to do repairs, and even lender required repairs. So it doesn't matter if you want to pay for a home inspection previously, or previous to accepting an offer, and attach that to your disclosures. Sure, it helps you more with the as is, because I'm disclosing to you the condition of the property as I know it. It does not preclude the buyer from still requesting repairs. So no matter what, the buyer has the right to request the repairs. And no matter what, the seller has the right to refuse the repairs. So everybody has to understand how both of those sides work. And I think if we're clearer in our conversations with our buyers and sellers from day one, we get less of that where the seller is upset that the buyer is asking for repairs, or that the buyer is upset that the seller isn't responding. It's because we're not communicating enough with both parties so that they understand that the true process is what it is. Okay. Questions about that? Any questions about the condition of the property? Okay. Seller remaining in possession after close of escrow. We've talked about that. That's where we include the SIP or the RLAS. The contingency removals. So this is another conversation that you have to have with your buyers and with your sellers. So as a buyer's agent, you have to make them understand that them removing their contingencies when it's time, as long as they're in a position to do so, right? So if I have 17 days to remove my investigations and I've done all my inspections, the property came back, I'm good with the condition of the property. I've got my appraisal done, the property came back and appraised. I have a very normal conditional approval on my loan. I get to all that stuff at day 17. I should be encouraging my buyer to remove their contingencies. Because once my buyer removes their contingencies, the seller is as locked in as the buyer is. I know I say this a lot, but the thought process of a buyer's agent who prefers to not remove contingencies and keep the momentum going in a transaction, it boggles my mind that you guys fight to not remove your buyer's contingencies. Ultimately, what should be happening is you should be advising your buyers that, hey, by the way, your loan, we have a normal conditional approval. That's not going to be an issue. Your appraisal came back. The appraisal's done. Everything's good. We went and did the inspections. All the investigations are good. We checked permits. Everything's good. I'm going to give you a contingency removal so we can send it to the buyer's agent or to the listing agent and remove contingency so we keep moving forward. But buyers agents refuse to do that. They try to hide and run and keep from moving that contingency as their contingency as long as possible. And every time I ask why, it's, well, because I don't want to lose my buyer's deposit. The buyer losing their deposit is not as common as people seem to believe it to be, but this is a legally binding contract that we're working under, and there's terms of that. And when I refuse to remove my contingency, I'm giving the seller an opportunity to cancel the transaction on me, because that's the only legitimate reason a seller can cancel, is if the buyer does not perform in some contractual obligation or a contingency period. So if there's something stated in a purchase agreement that has a number of days attached to it, that allows for a seller to send a notice to perform for the buyer to take that action, remove the contingency or complete the contractual obligation that's stated. And if the buyer fails to do that, then the seller can cancel. And so what happens is, by us removing the contingencies, unless the seller has a contingency of their own, we've now removed any opportunity that a seller has a legitimate way to cancel. And it gives us a stronger chance of closing the transaction. So I think that we have to have a conversation with our buyers, explain to them how contingencies work, when we're going to be removing contingencies. And I think also for buyers agents, you guys have to lose the notion of the contingency is there for us to get full underwriter loan approval, unconditional loan approval. That's not what it's there for. It's there to give you enough time to feel comfortable that the loan will go through and they'll be able to close. So I think you guys have to kind of step away from that. We don't have full loan approval, unconditional loan approval, so we're not removing the contingency. You're putting yourself in a position where you could get a notice to perform and ultimately lose the transaction. Because what happens if my buyer fails to remove their contingencies when it's time? Right? So I get a notice to perform and my buyer is out of town for a long weekend when I get that notice to perform. And I can't get them to sign the note to sign the contingency removal to move forward. The seller could cancel on me even if the buyer didn't want to cancel, because they weren't available to perform based on what the notice to perform was. And I've seen it happen. It's happened a lot of times. So again, having these conversations going into it so your buyer understands the importance of the time periods and why they exist is going to make it easier on you when it's time for you to say, okay, you're in a position where it's time for us to remove all the contingencies, and I think you should do that. That's it. Let's see what we got here. Listing agent sending a notice to per buyer to perform and not just the CR. Most of agents are scared. Yeah, well, a listing agent can send a CR to you, right, to tell you, hey, it's time to remove your contingencies. But if it's not attached to a notice to buyer to perform, it's meaningless. Okay, so it's notice to buyer to perform with the contingency removal. That's how you should be telling somebody, like, you need to remove your contingency. Okay, so here's the contingencies: the loan, the appraisal. It goes into the no appraisal contingency, how the loan contingency it cannot protect you if you didn't have an appraisal contingency, and the only reason that you don't qualify for the loan now is because of the appraisal. You can't use your loan contingency for that. Here's the investigation of property. It talks about that. Insurance. Here's the reference to that. Review of seller's documents, the title, the condo and the HOA documents. Removal or waiver of contingencies with offer. Buyer shall have no obligation to remove a contractual contingency unless seller has provided all required documents, reports, disclosures, information pertaining to that contingency. So, for example, when we see offers that you're writing or buyer's agents are writing that say, hey, we're removing all our contingencies with the offer, that's fine, but if you don't have the disclosures that are required, removal of that contingency doesn't really affect the buyer because there's time periods that go directly with those disclosures. So it's understanding. And that's what happens is when a listing agent says, well, you have to remove all your contingencies, but they don't explain to the seller that based on the disclosures, the buyer could still have ways to walk away. They get in trouble with their seller. right? Because they don't explain how things work. So again, just make sure that you're going through these things and explaining some of these things that we're talking about, so that it's clearly understood by both buyer and seller, because then you don't get questions later, okay? Items included, excluded. Here's a little bit more definition about those items included, excluded. Here is, it's going to say here, like, all these are the included. All existing fixtures and fittings that are attached to the property. Again, this is a conversation with a listing agent to a seller, and for a buyer's agent to understand, buyer to make their buyer understand how these things work, what should by default come with the property and what should be excluded. But you can see here: electrical, mechanical, lighting, plumbing, heating fixtures, ceiling fans, fireplace inserts, gas logs and grates, solar power, built-in appliances, and appliances for special openings. So if they made like a custom cabinet to fit something in there, even though it's not built in, it's supposed to stay. Window and door screens, awnings, shutters, window coverings, which includes blinds, curtains, drapery, shutters, and other material that cover any portion of the window. So, and any associated hardware and rods. So again, when you're talking to your sellers, make sure that they understand that they got to leave the curtains and the curtain rods and any other window coverings that are there. And if they're not planning to, it's something you have to address from the beginning. So here's where you could go to see all the stuff that has to be included and what normally is excluded. And here's the excluded stuff, right? So audio, video components, flat screen TV, speakers, and any of these items not itself attached to the property, even if a bracket or other mechanism attached to the component item is attached to the property. So you can't get people to leave their TV just because it's connected to the property, okay? Just remember that. Here's the allocation of cost sections. This is the statutory disclosures, including lead-based paint hazard. So this is everything that is mandatory. It does not matter whether it is a probate, an REO sale, a trust sale. These disclosures are required. So they have to be provided. Now, for certain things, and an SPQ will be replaced by an ESD. A TDS may not be required, but a natural hazard disclosure is, and a lead-based paint is, and that ESD, the exempt seller's disclosure, is. So these are all the things that are required by the state of California, statutory disclosures, to be delivered to the buyer, and they cannot be waived. There is nothing you can do to waive them. They have to be delivered. So, for example, if a buyer were to write something saying, I'm waiving my right to these disclosures, the seller could still be held responsible for non-disclosure because the state does not allow us to waive the delivery of these disclosures. So it's good to know that you talk to your client about all of these so they know what they should be expecting, and then explaining to the seller why they have to be delivered, why they're required, okay? Any such document shall be deemed an amendment to. So this is now saying if I amend disclosures, the time periods that go along with the disclosures are back into effect, right? So for us on looking at TDS, SPQ, or ESDs, they don't need to be amended based on something that we find out because of a buyer's inspection. So if a buyer goes and does an investigation or inspection and we find out that there's an issue with the foundation, the seller is not required for that transaction to amend any of their disclosures because they found that information based on the buyer's investigations. The buyer is aware of it. The seller is now made aware of it. There's no need to amend any disclosures. Now, if that transaction were to cancel, then I would have to amend my disclosures for any subsequent buyers that I may accept offers from, okay? One of the things that I wanted to jump down to so that you guys can see, where is it? I'm missing the section with the time. Right here. Buyers shall, in the time specified in paragraph 3L5, or 5 days after delivery of any disclosures specified in paragraph 11, defense paragraph 11D, whichever is later returned signed copies of the disclosures. So basically, yes, okay, sorry, my mind just, I totally went blank right now. With statutory disclosures, unless the seller hands them to me, like the listing agent walks up to the buyer and says, here are the disclosures, or to me and says, here are the disclosures by hand, there is a right of rescission for the buyer that is 5 days from delivery. Okay, so if the listing agent emails me all of the disclosures, the TDS, the SPQ, the NHD report, the lead-based paint, any of those listed disclosures in this paragraph, I have a 5-day right of rescission, which means I can just cancel based on the receipt of those documents. If they hand them to me in person, then it's 3 days after receipt that I have that right of rescission. So now what happens is if we have to amend any of those disclosures down the road, that 5-day right of rescission is back. Okay? So you guys have to understand that that's how that works. And explain to your buyers, hey, by the way, these disclosures are required to be delivered to you. And if there's anything on there that is unacceptable or we feel a little concerned about, even if I do not have an investigation inspection contingency, I still have the right to cancel. And that's why it's important for you guys as listing agents to understand that even if people say they have no contingencies, there are ways for buyers to extricate themselves from a transaction without getting penalized. Okay? So, but you have to understand that, because when we don't understand it, it's when it makes us look bad in front of our sellers, because the buyer is able to cancel and we can't stop them. Matthew, go ahead.
Hey, Kyle. So question kind of along that note is, yeah, because like, let's just say if one of my buyers like gets cold feet and then we opened escrow and then we wanted to drop, they're like, hey, you know what? We changed our mind. And I'm like, oh gosh, now I have to go back to that agent. If we draw up cancellation, would the correct way to put it on the contract would be like per this section, like per L3L, or what do you recommend?
Oh, yeah, I would always do 3L3, which is, if I'm not mistaken, let me go back so I can just double check. But 3L3 is the investigation period. So if we go back here, 3L3, investigation of property, I would just use that paragraph to cancel, because I still, obviously, we're just barely in escrow. We have that contingency in place. So that's what I would use. Okay. Or if you call the agent and they're like, yeah, sure, it's early, you haven't put your deposit in yet, I don't care, you could put per mutual agreement on there too on the cancellation.
Okay, got it. Okay, yeah, because I have to call the agent, but I think that he's that's what I'm thinking. So even if they didn't do any inspections or anything on the property, we could still do 3L3.
Yeah.
Okay,
you can.
Got it. Okay, just wondering. Thanks.
You're welcome. All right, let's see. So we went through those disclosures. We're going to jump ahead a little bit here. This is just, again, about the property investigations, the title. These are all the disclosures, the time periods and the removal of contingencies. If you want to know what things the seller is supposed to deliver to you in that 7 days, that was, in paragraph 3, right here is all the paragraphs that reference what is required to be delivered to the buyer in that 7 days. So paragraph 7A, paragraph 9B6, paragraph 10, paragraph 11A, 11B, 11C, 11D, 11H, 11K, 11L, 11M, 11N, 11O, 13A, 13D, and 32, right? So if you want to know, you could just go back to those paragraphs and see what documents are referenced there, and that's everything that has to be delivered by the seller to the buyer within the 7 days. The buyer has the right to review all of those documents, and if my seller's late on the delivery of those, the contingency period for the buyer to review those or 5 days after they receive them, whichever is greater, is still when the contingency has to be removed, right? So if I have a 17-day contingency, seller gives me all the documents on day 7 like they're supposed to, I have to remove my contingency on day 17. If the seller for some reason weren't to give me all of those documents until day 15, right, then I'd get 5 days after the delivery before I'm required to remove my contingency of that instead of my actual contingency period. So just understand how the time periods work and why it's important for the seller to deliver their items on time, okay? And let's go down. Sorry if I'm making you guys dizzy here. We're going to go down to where we actually, and make sure, again, just a reminder, make sure these are initialed by the buyers. We're going to go down to liquidated damages, okay? So liquidated damages is what we talk about when people say, oh, they could lose their deposit. That's what liquidated damages is. By the buyer initialing this paragraph, what they're stating is that we're committing to put our deposit in jeopardy should we act in bad faith. Now, the protection for the buyer and the reason that this exists is that you're limited to 3% of the purchase price in the damages you could lose. And what that means is, it doesn't mean that the seller can come after you for 3%. It just means they're limited to 3% of the initial 3% of the purchase price, and that's based on the initial deposit. So if I put a $10,000 deposit in escrow and I have $1 million house, right? I'm not going to lose 3% of the purchase price if something goes wrong. I'm potentially going to lose the $10,000. Okay? Because I'm protected to the amount of my initial deposit or 3%. Now, if I had put, $300,000 in, that would be different, right? But I'm putting $10,000 in. Or if I put $30,000 in, that'd be different. It's just understanding how that protection works, right? That's it. Just understanding how that protection works. I'm limited to 3%. If my initial deposit and increased deposit exceeds 3% of the purchase price, I can only lose 3%. The rest of it has to be returned to me. Now, that's only in the case of 1 to 4 unit properties. And it's only if the buyer is going to occupy the property as their principal residence. So if I am an investor, my damages are not limited to that 3% of the purchase price. Okay? So keep that in mind. That liquidated damages doesn't work for an investor like it does for a buyer who is buying their principal residence 1 through 4 units, okay? But that's what that is. Now, if I were you, the benefit of for this is I would always tell my buyers to initial that, because it's me showing that I have some skin in the game, and I'm willing to show you that if I act in bad faith, you have the right to keep my deposit. And then again, it protects me to that 3% number, that I can't lose more than my initial deposit, if something were to go wrong. It's good for your buyer to sign it. It's good for the seller to sign it, to initial it. Yes, the seller is saying that if they act in bad faith, that, I'm going to only maybe have $10,000 or $8,000 that is going to, that I may have the right to keep from the buyer for their bad faith. But you don't have to prove any damages. If they act in bad faith, even if you may have to fight for that deposit, the chances are they're not going to win. If they truly acted in bad faith, they're going to have to release the deposit to you. You don't have to prove that you lost that money in order to retain it. If we didn't have this in place and a deal canceled and the seller wanted to keep a deposit because of they felt they were damaged in some way, right? They lost money because of that transaction. They'd have to show proof of the damages they incurred in order for a judge to say, or a mediator to say, hey, you deserve X amount of money, okay? So you'd have to take the time to prove it. 5 units or more commercial is not limited to 3%. No, there's no liquidated damage for that. And again, it's also not, again, for investors, it doesn't have any protection for them on liquidated damages. Any other questions about liquidated damages? Okay. The next section here is arbitration of disputes. This section, right, mediation, whether I initial this paragraph 28 or not, we are required to go to mediation before in any dispute that happens between a buyer and a seller. Even if you don't go to arbitration, you're going to go straight to litigation, file a lawsuit, be in front of a judge or a jury to decide this dispute. You have to go to mediation first. And if either party refuses the mediation, that party cannot collect their legal fees if they are the party that prevails in the dispute, right? So if I refuse mediation, a buyer sues me as seller because there was a dispute about something, and I say I'm not going to mediation, and we go straight to court, then if I win, I cannot request that the buyer pay my legal fees for defending myself because I refused the mediation. So you got to go to mediation first, even if you don't initial arbitration of disputes here. Okay. Even if and we're not going to read this whole thing, but even if I initial this as buyer that says I want to go through arbitration, binding arbitration, as opposed to litigation. And again, this is just a choice. This is a personal choice. Like, you can't say you have to your buyer. You can talk to them about it, but really, ultimately, difference-wise, the only difference really between going to litigation as opposed to arbitration is you cannot appeal an arbitration decision. It is binding and you can't appeal it. You have to live by that decision. With litigation, you can appeal and try to get a different outcome. Arbitration is slightly faster. It is slightly less expensive, but not enough where you would say, oh, this is a total benefit to you. Okay, it just is. It's just a slightly faster, slightly less expensive. So if the buyer says, yeah, I want to, great, have them initial. If they say, no, I don't want to initial that, don't force them to initial. Now, if the seller counters you on your offer and says, no, I want that initialed, if they want the property, then they're going to be forced to initial it. One party can't initial it and the other not. It doesn't work like that. So regardless, it has to be countered. If a buyer initials this and the seller doesn't want to, they have to initial that this paragraph 28 is being excluded from the purchase agreement and that the seller will not initial that. If the buyer doesn't initial it and the seller wants to, then the seller needs to counter back, hey, buyer to initial paragraph 28 and send a new copy of page 14 with this counteroffer. Okay? So again, you can't, as the buyer's agent, you should never tell anybody they have to initial this. Just explain to them the differences, what it means. Let them make the choice on whether they want to. They may ask you, do you think I should? And you could say, look, it's slightly less expensive, slightly faster. If that's important to you, know that that's what that means for you. But just know it can't be appealed. So if the decision doesn't go your way, you don't get a second shot at it. So it's up to you what you want to do. If it were me, I probably would initial this, but you're not required to. Okay? So that's it for the filling out. Now, what I would suggest when we get down here to this section is make sure that if for some reason you have an entity buyer that you're checking this box off and you're putting the name of the legally authorized signers, who they are, in here so that you can actually have them sign their name for the entity. If there are more than two signers for there, you're going to include the additional signature addendum. Remember, so let's say if there's 3 buyers and I have an additional signature addendum, remember, 2 buyers are on the RPA. Only the 3rd buyer that couldn't sign here, only their name goes on the ASA. Okay? When you're accepting the offer as listing agent, technically you guys are supposed to sign this offer and send it with your counteroffer or seller's multiple counteroffer. But I know that most of us don't do that. They don't want to send 18 pages of an offer plus a counter and everything else that needs to go in. I get it. So just know that technically you're supposed to sign this subject to the counteroffer, send this attached counteroffer and the offer back to the buyer. I get it. We just do the counteroffers. Okay. If you're making a backup offer, you're going to want to check that off. Again, for the entity sellers, fill this section out. If you do that, you don't need to do an RCSD if you fill out the section. If you don't, if it's not filled out properly, then you got to provide the RCSD. Okay, keep that in mind. Make sure everybody signs. Okay, again, as listing agent, if you are not accepting an offer, you have the seller initial, there's no counteroffer being made, and this offer was not accepted by the seller on the date that he initials this. And then send that back to the buyer. Now, I know we're not all going to do that, but if a buyer requests it, a buyer's agent requests it in writing, you're required to provide it to them. It is a violation of CRMLS and CAR if you don't provide proof of presentation. Okay? Make sure all this stuff is correct, because the designated electronic delivery address is this email that you have when you write the offer. If not, you can attach this form, the DEDA, and I'll show you what that looks like. It's to clarify who what the designated delivery addresses are, like your email address, your text, your cell phone for text, and an alternate email if you want. If you do that, then it's easier to show proof that those things were delivered. But that's what that's for. Okay, that's all that's for. All right, now I gotta go all the way to the bottom again. Sorry, guys. Okay, so make sure all this stuff is correct, that it's filled out, that you have the license numbers in there, and as much information as you can. Have the buyer initial it again. You don't need to do anything here. This is if you were to present, if you present the offer, you should initial your initials and the date that you presented the offer. And that is writing the offer. We've gone through it. We're done with that. Now, later on, a month or two from now, we'll go through like not writing the offer, but like in depth of going through like those paragraphs that we just skipped over today, what those explanations are and the importance of them, and how to protect everybody. We'll go through that later. But for now, we've gone through writing this new offer the way it is, the RPA. So does anybody have any questions before I let you guys go? Anybody? All right. Well, I'm glad you guys understood it. Hopefully you understood it and you're not afraid to ask me a question. So this will be on YouTube later today. So that would be the complete series is there now. So if you want to go back, if you missed the previous ones, or you wanted to be able to see it all the way through, they're all there now. So all 4 parts are there now will be there now for later today, so that you guys can go through and review and always have this as a reference when you're writing offers. So if you guys don't have any other questions for me, don't need help with anything, then I will let you go. Have a wonderful day. Go be productive and stay safe, and I'll talk to you guys soon.